In the late 1800s, Rosewood Manor was known for its wealth and luxury. The large estate, that is located near a misty forest, was owned by the Harrington family. They were famous for hosting big parties and living a life of extravagance, and the Harringtons were seen as the most powerful family in the area, and their name was respected by all. But the manor itself, with its tall towers and detailed carvings, seemed to hold many secrets that only the family truly understood. But over time, strange rumors began to spread about the manor. The servants, especially those who had worked there for a long time, talked about odd things happening. Cold winds in the middle of summer, strange sounds in empty rooms, and shadows that moved on their own. Despite these eerie stories, the Harringtons ignored them and continued their luxurious lifestyle. Then, on a stormy night in 1897, everything changed, because the entire Harrington family vanished without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle, and nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was still in its place, their clothes were left untouched, and the silverware was set out as if waiting for the next dinner. But in the master bedroom, a bloody note was found that read, "The house remembers." After the family disappeared, the manor was left to decay. No one wanted to go near it, and locals said they could hear ghostly laughter late at night. The few brave people who got close to the manor said the air felt heavy and like someone was watching them. Over time, Rosewood Manor became a legend, a dark reminder of the mystery and fear hidden within its walls. Then, the years passed, but the tragic legacy of Rosewood Manor seemed to linger and extend far beyond the Harrington family. In the 1920s, the Anderson family moved into the manor, hoping for a fresh start. They found the house in disrepair, but believed they could restore it to its former grandeur. But, as they settled in, disaster struck, because financial ruin shadowed them, and a once thriving business collapsed. Desperate and broken, the Andersons were forced to leave after just 1 year, and their dreams shattered like the crumbling walls of the manor. In the 1950s, the Dawsons, a young couple with a small child, moved in, and they were undeterred by the rumors that had plagued the estate. They hoped the manor would be their forever home. But tragedy soon struck when their daughter, Leela, vanished without a trace. Then, a frantic search turned up nothing, and no explanation was ever found for her disappearance. Heartbroken and filled with fear, the Dawsons fled and whispered that the house might have taken her, even though none dared to speak it aloud. By the 1980s, the Paris family came next, and hopeful that they could escape their past and start a new life. But it wasn't long before strange occurrences began to unravel their peace. Shadows shifted off their own accord, whispers echoed from dark corners, and soon the family members began seeing things that weren't there. The terrifying shadows whispered their darkest fears and slowly drove them to madness. Once a vibrant family, the Paris family was left broken, and they fled the manor, and left behind only the remnants of their torment. Mrs. Graves, a local historian, had spent years documenting the events surrounding the manor. Then she tried to warn each new family that came, but her warnings were ignored. No one believed the house was cursed, and no one stayed long enough to prove it. Now the dark history of Rosewood Manor only grew, with each new chapter more horrifying than the last. Then, one day in the summer of 1995, the Cooper family arrived at Rosewood Manor, and they were attracted by its charm and the surprisingly affordable price. John Cooper, a practical architect, saw great potential in the aging house, but his wife, Helen, an artist with a strong belief in the supernatural, felt both uneasy and drawn to the manor. Their teenage children, Emily and Lucas, had mixed emotions. Emily, the rebellious daughter, was eager for a change, while Lucas, the younger of the two, had always been fascinated by the unknown. At first glance, the house seemed perfect for their new beginning, because it was grand with ivy crawling up its stone walls, John was excited to renovate and his mind was filled with ideas for its future. But Helen couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was off, because her intuition told her there was something strange about the manor. But she kept her concerns to herself, not wanting to spoil the excitement of their new home. Emily, a skeptic, dismissed the idea of ghosts. She thought the rumors surrounding the house were nothing more than small-town gossip, designed to scare away potential buyers. Lucas, on the other hand, was captivated. He found himself drawn to the manor, and spent hours wandering the overgrown gardens, and lost in thoughts of the history and secrets it might hold. But what the family didn't realize was that they were walking into something far beyond what they expected. Now Rosewood Manor seemed to have been waiting for them, and ready to bring its next chapter of fear and mystery to life. The Cooper family's first night in Rosewood Manor was deeply unsettling, because the old house creaked and groaned as though it were alive, whispering secrets to anyone brave enough to listen. One night, Emily was unable to sleep, and she wandered through the hallways. And then she felt a chill creeping down her spine. As she passed the grand staircase, suddenly she heard a faint and soft laugh echoing through the space. Then her heart raced, but she quickly dismissed it as a trick of her imagination. Later that night, Lucas woke in the dark, and his eyes were drawn to the foot of his bed, because he saw a shadowy figure, standing motionless and staring at him with hollow eyes. Then, his breath caught in his throat, but before he could move, the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. He rubbed his eyes and tried to convince himself it had been a nightmare. But when he checked under the bed and in the closet, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking his head, he tried to drift back to sleep, but he couldn't sleep as he felt he wasn't alone lingered in the air. The next morning, Helen was the first to notice something strange. Her art supplies, which she had left neatly arranged in the studio, were now scattered across the room. Brushes, paints, and canvases overturned as though someone had been rifling through them. Then she felt a coldness hung in the air, uninvited and out of place. But once again, she kept her worries to herself. Meanwhile, John was beginning to sense something unsettling too. His blueprints for the renovation, which he had left neatly in his office, were now covered in strange and jagged lines. Lines that didn't belong to him. The phrase, "The house remembers," was scrawled repeatedly across the pages. Its meaning was unclear, but its presence was undeniable. Then John's mind raced and tried to make sense of the mysterious occurrences. But deep down, he could feel the creeping unease that something was wrong. Curious and increasingly uneasy, Lucas began to investigate the history of the house. Then one day in the attic, he uncovered old journals from past residents, each filled with stories of fear, paranoia, and a haunting sense of being watched. As he read through the accounts, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The house, it seemed, had a memory of its own, a memory that would soon make itself known to the Coopers in terrifying ways. As the Cooper family settled into Rosewood Manor, they started to interact more with the townspeople. The local market, where they went to buy supplies, was filled with uneasy stares and whispered conversations. It was as if every person in town knew something the Coopers didn't. At the small general store, an old shopkeeper named Ben greeted them with a forced smile. His eyes were tired as if he had seen too much, and when he spoke, his words carried an unsettling weight. "Then Ben asked you folks new to the manor?" John replied, "We just moved in." Then Ben's gaze dropped to the counter, and his hands trembled slightly as he wiped it down. He said quietly, "You might want to keep your distance from that house," glancing over his shoulder, as though to make sure no one was listening. And then he said, "Strange things have happened there and things that no one can explain." Helen felt the weight of his words, but John dismissed them and chalked it up to superstition. He was used to people being suspicious of things they didn't understand. But Helen, ever curious, couldn't ignore the ominous warning. Later that day, she sought out Mrs. Graves, the town historian, who was known for knowing everything about Rosewood Manor's past. Mrs. Graves, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile, welcomed Helen into her home. Then she said, "You're not the first to ask about that house." Her voice tinged with something between sadness and fear. The Harringtons were once the wealthiest family in the area, but one night they vanished and left nothing behind but a cryptic note. And then the town has never been the same since. Helen listened and captivated as Mrs. Graves told her the stories of the Harrington family's mysterious disappearance. It seemed that every family who had moved into the manor after them had suffered some great tragedy. Mrs. Graves spoke in hushed tones, recounting tales of deaths, disappearances, and madness, each victim tied to the house in ways that defied logic. Then, Helen, unsettled by the stories, returned home with more questions than answers. John, however, remained skeptical. To him, the tales were nothing more than legends, passed down by fearful townsfolk to explain the inexplicable. For him, the house was just an old building in need of renovation. But Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something darker lay beneath the surface, something that even John would soon have to face. Later, the strange occurrences in Rosewood Manor escalated quickly, and Emily was the first to experience something truly horrifying. One night, as she passed the old and dust-covered mirror in the hallway, suddenly she froze because a figure appeared in the reflection, standing just behind her. It was a woman, and her face was pale and twisted. Her eyes were hollow and cold. Then Emily turned quickly, but when she looked back at the mirror, there was nothing there. That night, Emily lay awake in her bed, her eyes wide open, as the house creaked and groaned. Then a soft whisper echoed in the darkness, and it was so faint, at first, that she thought it was her imagination. But then, clear as day, she heard her name, Emily. Then she gasped, stood up, and her heart was pounding in her chest. She looked around her room, but there was no one there. Her breaths came in short and shaky gasps as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She told herself it was just a nightmare, but the whispers continued, night after night. Meanwhile, John had his own unsettling experience, because he hired a team of construction workers to begin the renovations. But when they arrived at the manor, they refused to step inside. They muttered about strange vibes and cursed houses, and no amount of money could convince them to stay. John, frustrated and confused, dismissed their fears. "It's just an old house, that's all," he told himself. But even he could feel a sense of unease creeping up on him. As the tension in the house grew, the family began to fracture, because Emily's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would stare off into space for hours, talking to someone invisible, and her once vibrant demeanor faded. Helen, now deeply concerned, started to believe that something in the house was affecting her daughter, something far beyond any explanation she could offer. But John remained stubborn and refused to accept that anything supernatural could be at play. He insisted, "We just need to focus on the renovations," ignoring the creeping dread that seemed to settle over the house like a thick fog. But it was becoming clear that Rosewood Manor was far more than just an old building. It was a force drawing them deeper into its grip, and soon they would all face the terrifying consequences. Now Emily's transformation became undeniable. Once she was a vibrant teenager, but she now seemed like a shadow of her former self. Her bright eyes were hollow and distant, as if she was seeing something that no one else could. And she began speaking in a soft and eerie voice to someone invisible, her words cryptic and unsettling. She whispered one evening, "I can hear them. They are calling me and telling me to come." Helen's heart ached as she watched her daughter slip further away from her. Then, Emily began writing strange poetry, words that spoke of darkness, death, and the house swallowing everything in its path. Her art, once filled with color and life, now consisted of disturbing drawings of the manor consuming people, and their faces were twisted in terror. But John was still refusing to acknowledge the supernatural, and blaming the stress of moving and the house's disrepair for Emily's strange behavior. He said she's just adjusting, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was becoming impossible because the house was feeding off their fear, and grew stronger with every argument and every tear. Now the tension in the family reached a boiling point. Helen began to believe that Emily's strange behavior was related to this house, but John remained silent that it was just a superstition. Later their disagreements grew more heated in the house. In the dead of night, they could all hear the whispers again, soft at first, but growing louder, as if the house itself was speaking to them and urged them to surrender. As the house's grip tightened, the Cooper family realized that they were no longer merely living in Rosewood Manor. They were at the mercy of whatever haunted its walls. After numerous incidents in the house, Helen delved deeper into the manor's history, and she uncovered a chilling tale from the 1800s that seemed to explain everything. The story was that of Eliza Blackwood, a woman accused of witchcraft during a time of hysteria and fear. Eliza had been a healer, and she was known for her knowledge of herbs and remedies. But when the local villagers grew afraid of her abilities, they falsely accused her of dark magic. Then, the Harrington family, driven by their own fear and greed, played a key role in her execution, condemning her to death. On the day of her death, Eliza cursed the Harrington family and the land they owned. Her final words were haunting. The house remembers. The legend claimed that her spirit, filled with rage and sorrow, would haunt the house forever and seek vengeance for the wrongs done to her. And now, it seemed, her curse was reaching out to the Coopers. Now Helen felt the weight of the revelation settle over her like a dark cloud. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was the land itself, and cursed by the spirit of a woman wronged. Eliza's anger and thirst for revenge had festered over the years, poisoning every soul that dared to live in Rosewood Manor. The Coopers now understood that the whispers, the strange occurrences, and Emily's descent into madness were all part of Eliza's curse. If they didn't act quickly, they would fall victim to the house's insatiable hunger for vengeance. As the family came to grips with the truth, they realized that Rosewood Manor was not just a haunted house. It was a prison, and they were its next captives. One rainy afternoon, Lucas decided to explore some parts of the area. The house was huge and had lots of secret rooms and dark corners. Then he went down to the basement, which was really scary and dusty, and the floor made loud noises when he walked on it. Then, Lucas found a secret door behind a bunch of spiderwebs. He opened it slowly and went inside. The room was really dark and cold, and the walls had weird symbols that seemed to glow. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, upon which rested an old leather-bound diary. The pages were yellowed with age, and the spine cracked as Lucas gently opened it. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat when he saw the name written inside. Eliza Blackwood. The diary was hers. As Lucas flipped through the pages, a chill crawled down his spine. The words were filled with despair, pain, and madness. Eliza wrote of a ritual gone horribly wrong, one that had bound her soul to the very land of Rosewood Manor. She had sought revenge on those who had condemned her, but something had twisted her thirst for justice into something far darker. Lucas read aloud, "Only a blood debt can break the curse." The words seemed to burn into his mind, and suddenly, the room felt smaller and colder. Shadows shifted around him, dark forms that seemed to follow his every movement. Lucas slammed the book shut, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. With a heavy heart, Lucas left the room, the diary clutched tightly in his hands. He knew now that they weren't just living in a haunted house. They were trapped in a nightmare, bound to a curse they could never fully escape. Later, The house seemed to come alive with a dark, angry force. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, they heard a loud crash echo through the halls. Then, windows shattered all at once, sending pieces of glass across the floor. The walls groaned and bent, almost as if the house itself was alive and reacting to something unseen. Suddenly, Emily screamed as she was thrown across the room. Her body was lifted by invisible hands, and she gasped for air, and her throat was feeling like it was being squeezed shut. Helen ran to help her, but before she could, the paintings, normally hanging quietly on the walls, changed. The scary and monster-like figures she had painted came to life, twisting and moving, reaching out with sharp claws and glowing, evil eyes. Then John tried to calm everyone down, but his voice was shaky. The house was no longer just a building. It was like a living creature, full of hate, and it determined to destroy them. Then he tried to block the doors and windows, but the walls seemed to push back, stopping any escape. The family huddled together in the living room, surrounded by chaos. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind, felt like a new danger. Fear settled in as the house kept attacking them. They couldn't pretend anymore. This wasn't just a nightmare. The supernatural was real, and it wanted them. Then Helen whispered, "Maybe we should leave, and maybe we can run away from this place." But John shook his head. "It won't let us. Whatever is in this house, it's not going to let us go." For the first time, John admitted it. There was something dark and powerful here, something they couldn't escape from. Later the house was more haunted and Emily began to change again. But this time, it was far worse. She no longer seemed like herself at all. Her voice was different, and her eyes were blank and cold, empty. One night, she stood in front of the family, and her body was trembling as though caught in the grip of some unseen force. Then, her voice, her sweet, familiar voice changed. Emily spoke. "Time is running out," but the words didn't come from her lips. They seemed to rise from somewhere deeper inside, as if something else was using her body as a vessel. The family watched in horror as Emily's eyes glazed over. And then, Eliza Blackwood's voice emerged from her mouth. The voice said, "I am bound by vengeance, cold and unforgiving, and I will not rest until justice is served." The realization hit them like a tidal wave. Emily wasn't just haunted by Eliza's spirit. She was possessed. Eliza's spirit, trapped in the house for centuries, spoke to them of the curse and the pain that had fueled her rage. She explained that the only way to break the curse was to exact revenge on the descendants of those who had wronged her. The Harringtons, the Coopers, now trapped in her wrath, were given an ultimatum. Eliza demanded, "Find them, the true descendants of the Harringtons. Make them pay for what they did, or you will all suffer as I have suffered." The words echoed in their minds long after Emily's voice fell silent. Now the Coopers were no longer just fighting for their lives. They were now part of Eliza's twisted plan for vengeance. With Eliza's chilling words still echoing in their minds, Helen and John knew time was running out. Then, they threw themselves into research, combing through town records, old newspapers, and family trees, because they were desperate to find any clue that could lead them to the last living Harrington descendant. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the curse pressed heavily on them. Lucas, determined to understand the depths of Eliza's anger, attempted to communicate with her spirit. Alone in the basement, surrounded by the occult symbols on the walls, he called out to Eliza and pleaded with her to release her grip on Emily and the house. But it was Helen who finally uncovered the truth. A distant descendant of the Harrington family still lived in town. Ben, the local shopkeeper. The discovery sent a chill down her spine. Ben was a kind and gentle man, and he was known for his generosity and compassion. He had no knowledge of the curse and no hint of his bloodline's dark past. Confronting Ben seemed their only option, but the family was torn. Could they really involve him in this? Ben had done nothing wrong, but his bloodline carried the burden of the curse. Was he truly responsible for Eliza's wrath? Or was he just another innocent victim caught in the web of fate? As they prepared to meet Ben, the Coopers knew they were standing on the edge of a precipice. The search for the last Harrington descendant was their final hope, but it was also a dangerous gamble. The curse had already claimed so much. How much more would they have to lose before they could break it? The Coopers stood frozen in the center of the living room, because the weight of Eliza's demands pressing down on them, unbearable fog. The air felt colder now, as if the house itself was listening and waiting for their decision. Lucas' eyes flicked to Emily, who sat in the corner. Her body was trembling and her face was a pale mask of pain. The possession had only worsened in the past few days, and the spirit inside her relentlessly fought for control. There were moments when Emily would regain some semblance of herself, staring at them with pleading eyes, but those moments were growing fewer by the hour. Eliza's voice echoed through the walls, a cold, merciless reminder that time was running out. Find the Harringtons, make them pay, or I will take everything you love. The choice before them was unbearable. The only way to break the curse and save Emily was to sacrifice Ben, the kind-hearted shopkeeper who had no idea of his bloodline's dark history. But the moral dilemma tore at their hearts. Could they really condemn an innocent man to appease a vengeful spirit? Helen's voice trembled as she spoke, her words barely a whisper. We can't just kill him, and there has to be another way. John clenched his fists and felt the weight of the decision crush him. His mind raced with thoughts, each one darker than the last. But if we don't, Eliza will destroy everything. Now she has already taken so much from us. Emily, she's slipping away. Emily cried out, her body convulsing as Eliza's voice took over again, sharp and commanding. You must act, now. Then, Lucas turned to his family, and his heart was heavy with the impossible decision they were about to make. We have no choice, and we have to do something. As the shadows in the house grew deeper and more suffocating, Emily's voice cut through the chaos. A final plea. Please, don't sacrifice him. I don't want anyone else to suffer because of me. But it was too late, because the choice had already been made. Later, Lucas paced the basement chamber, and the flickering candlelight was casting long and jagged shadows across the walls. He could no longer tell if he was speaking to Eliza's spirit, or if it was simply the house itself and its oppressive atmosphere twisting everything. Reality, morality, and even time. Lucas said into the darkness, I will not kill him. His voice was steady, despite the weight pressing on him. But I can promise you this. Your story will be told, Eliza. We will let the world know what happened here. We will bring justice to your memory, without harming Ben. For a moment, silence filled the air. Then, a cold and mocking laugh echoed through the room. Eliza's voice rasped, you think you can escape the price of vengeance? Filled with malice, you are bound to this house, to my curse, and the blood debt must be paid. Lucas steadied himself and said, we will make the blood debt symbolic, not literal. I will ensure that everyone knows the truth of what happened here. I will make sure they remember you. Then, the temperature in the room dropped, and a soft voice, tinged with doubt, responded. You dare defy me. You will perform a ritual, and it was a test of faith. Only then I will consider sparing you all. A chill ran through Lucas. A ritual. Then Eliza said, you will acknowledge my pain and vow to keep my story alive. Only then I will consider your proposition. Then Lucas nodded, and his heart was pounding in his chest, because this was their only chance. The only way to prevent more innocent lives from being destroyed by the curse. Later, the Coopers gathered in the basement, where Eliza's power was at its strongest. Now the air was colder than it had ever been, and the walls were pulsing, with an unnatural energy that seemed to press in on them. Then, Lucas held the diary tightly in one hand, Eliza's chilling words echoing in his mind. Emily stood beside him, and her body was trembling with the weight of the possession. Now they had prepared as best they could, but fear gripped them. The very atmosphere in the room felt thick with malevolence, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward them from every corner. Then, Helen stepped forward and clutched a small and ancient locket, an heirloom that had been passed down through generations of their family. It symbolized their unity and their bond. Then she placed it carefully on the pedestal, offering it as a gesture of goodwill. She said, "I offer this as a sign of our willingness to help you find peace, Eliza. We want to honor your memory, and we want to give you the justice you have been denied." Then Emily, her face contorted in agony, stepped forward as well. She could feel Eliza's spirit stirring within her and urged her to complete the ritual. Emily whispered, I can't do this," her voice barely a breath. "Please, Eliza, let me go." But Eliza's spirit wasn't swayed by pleas. Emily's body jerked violently, and she screamed, as her hands reached out for the locket, because the ritual had to be completed. As Emily chanted Eliza's words, the house fought back. The walls cracked open with a deafening roar, sending shards of stone and wood scattering across the room. Shadows leapt from the floor, attacking them. Their whispers were filling the air and trying to tear them apart, but they held firm and refused to break. Then, Lucas' voice rang out above the chaos. "We are doing this for you, Eliza. We are making things right." Finally, as the last words were spoken, the room fell silent. The shadows dissipated, the walls ceased their trembling, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the house was silent. The silence in Rosewood Manor was deafening. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the house had surrendered. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the Coopers for so long had lifted. Now the shadows had retreated, and the air, once thick with dread, now felt lighter. Then, Emily collapsed to the ground and gasping for breath. The spirit that had tormented her for so long was finally gone, and her body was hers again. Helen rushed to her daughter's side, pulling her close. "You are free, Emily. You are finally free." But even in the calm, the Coopers knew better than to relax completely. The house had been silent before, only to rise up again with renewed fury. The curse may have been broken, but the house itself would never be forgotten. As they packed up their things and prepared to leave the place that had torn their lives apart, Lucas looked out the window at the decaying mansion behind them. He said, "We can't forget what happened here," his voice soft but firm. "We will tell Eliza's story, and we will make sure the world knows the truth." Ben, who had agreed to help them, stood at the door of his shop and prepared to open it to the public. He had no idea how close he had come to being part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The Coopers drove away, the morning sun breaking through the clouds. But, as they left, a whisper of the wind chilled their bones. The house never forgets. The curse may have been broken, but the memories of Rosewood Manor would live on forever. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.